Alright, hello, this is It Lurks Below. And this game actually has quite a pedigree because it was made by David Brevik, or at least his new, very, very small company that seems to consist mostly of himself, honestly, called Greybeard Games. And if you don't know who David Brevik is, he was, back in the day, one of the sort of people behind what was Blizzard North, and he is also the creator of Diablo and Diablo 2, as well as Hellgate London, but we don't hear very many people talking about that anymore, which, you know, it was super jank, but I also thought it had some charm to it. Anyway, Diablo 2 is probably the one that sticks out the most to people in that particular group of games because, probably just like me, I know a lot of other people put just untold amounts of hours into that game and lost a lot of their childhood time to it because it was amazing. And it's always cool to see people that made some of the venerable games of old, I guess you could say, sort of coming back to apply their knowledge to something new. And that's what we have here. Although this game superficially resembles something like Terraria, it actually plays almost nothing like it, besides the very obvious, 2D block-based kind of thing. Because whereas something like Terraria is really more of a sort of an open-world sandbox, very creative game where you're meant to sort of make your own fun, although there are, just like something like Minecraft, there are goals for you to actually work towards. You don't actually have to, necessarily, if you don't want to, you don't actually have to enter hard mode if you just want to, roam around the world of Terraria and gather materials to make the most, gray, phallic castle possible. You can do that, and, that's not what this is. This is not a sandbox game. This is actually an ARPG. It's very much like Diablo and things like that, only instead of being in a sort of 3D or isometric perspective, it is 2D. And it has most of the trimmings that you would really expect from a game like that. Like, for instance, there are 8 different classes for you to choose from, and each one will have different capabilities. I'll talk more about how the actual skills work in a minute, because it's kind of unique. And there's lots and lots of loot with, randomly generated prefixes and suffixes and all that to add various statistics to the loot, and of course there are various rarities and things like that, all of the trimmings that you would expect, but there's also the whole idea of it being a 2D block-based world where you can dig around, find ore, and make a farm for yourself and things like that, because actually this is a survival game, sort of at its core, with survival elements like hunger, stamina, and the need to sleep, to restore yourself, and the need to keep a supply of food going to make sure you don't starve to death, and all that fun stuff. And it actually, I think, pulls it off pretty well, with the exception of winter, but again, we'll get into that later. And the actual main goal of the game is to delve the dungeon, which is just everything below the surface level, effectively. The entire ground is just a dungeon. And the dungeon itself consists of many, many different layers with their own materials and themes, and their own boss at the end that you will have to work your way through. And there are also lots of pre-generated structures and the what would be considered prefabs in the realm of roguelikes and other randomly generated games that use tiles and the that the world around it will be sort of random. It'll be a bit different every time, but the actual buildings themselves are built by hand and will be placed in such a way as they make sense. As you can probably see in the map on the bottom left of the screen right now, there is a sort of horizontal band at the bottom of the biome layer that is a dungeon. It is, a connected series of rooms that have been made by hand. And every layer actually has one of those. And somewhere in that will be the boss, a room that takes you to, it's like a boss door. Basically, it takes you to a separate dimensional arena where you fight a horrifying boss. And the theme of the game is basically that there has been an unknown cataclysm in this world, and the horrors that lurk below the ground, I said horrors, that lurk below the ground, need to be fought and rooted out, and you will of course eventually just try and find the source of what actually happened. And there are in fact these sort of journal entries that you can find, and these little shrines below the ground that will give you some of the lore behind the game and the world as it was before you came along, for the most part. Now, I mentioned skills, so the 8 classes available range from things like a paladin or a warrior to things like a bard or a wizard, and even things a little more esoteric like a necromancer or an enchanter, and a few others. And they're pretty cool because each one definitely plays a lot differently, and the overall weapon selection that you'll have will be very different depending on who you choose. So ranged versus melee weapons are very much a thing that you can find and specialize in, and they don't work the same at all. The actual combat is pretty fantastic, honestly, for a 2D, I guess, Terraria-like combat system where it's a lot of clicking, but in this case, the weapons have quite a bit of impact to them, especially the melee weapons when they add a lot of like screen shake and things like that. You know, that helps with adding impact to the weapons. And as far as the ranged weapon goes, the ranged weapons are kind of like magic guns. They're sort of fascinating. They're a bit like they look like rifles basically, but made of wood, and that's kind of what they are. They're just like projectors of magic energy in various forms. There are things like scattershot ones and like reflector ones, which have larger projectiles that bounce around the place, and everything in between, including things that just like spray poison everywhere. It's sort of great, and there are lots of different things to find, and of course, as you would expect with an ARPG, lots and lots of different loot with various different statistics to actually build yourself into a very powerful character. And the skills that you obtain are done in two different ways, but they're all in the form of items, actually. Instead of getting like a skill menu or some sort of like intangible skill icon, it's actually an item that you equip. In the sort of bottom right part of the hotbar that you see down there, there's a section for what's called ancient items, and these are your skills. You can find these just by exploring and by like killing rare enemies and the like, and you also will get a selection of class-based skills or ancient items as you level up. And these ancient items and the skills you get from them are most definitely where the main variety of the classes actually come from. For instance, in the background, I'm playing a necromancer right now, of course, because I always do, and the skills that you get are really pretty cool. You get everything from like the ability to summon these floating skulls that will follow you around and attack enemies for you, to this scythe that basically like sweeps an area around you with like this weird bloody explosion that does a bunch of damage, poison damage specifically, so it can poison enemies around you, and also absorbs health from them, to things like the Ancient Heart, which is probably overpowered a little bit, but that seems to be kind of a theme of this game, is that the later level items give you like very powerful class skills, and the Heart actually gives you the ability to just straight up fly whenever you want, so you can fly all around the place, which is extremely useful and a lot of fun. And that makes me want to try some of the other classes out and see what they get as their like level 30 or level 20 items, and what you can sort of build them into. I have a feeling things like the Enchanter and the Wizard would be a lot of fun, as well as like a Paladin would probably have a lot of like heavy swords and weird light powers and things. It'd probably be pretty great. And there's also, as you can see there, a survival mechanic. So as I mentioned, you do have to eat, and you have this sort of hunger and stamina meter on the left. I suppose meter, it's more like a count. And that allows you to see just, you know, how close you are to being horribly screwed underground by the various things you need to keep yourself up on. And you can actually get farms and the like to actually put above ground, and instead of in something like Terraria, where you're sort of building a town specifically to attract multiple NPCs, and sort of like almost building a kingdom effectively above ground, and it lurks below, what you're doing is actually just creating a sort of small settlement mainly for yourself. And there are buildings that you'll be able to eventually craft and place, although they're like prefab buildings. You can build onto them, but the building itself will already have a specific appearance to it. And you can add those to your settlement, and you will eventually create like a small circle of like merchants and pet salesmen and this guy behind this weird scraggly tree that lets you get your items back if you lose them when you die, all sorts of things. And you will, of course, not really be necessarily trying to build a huge above-ground complex as much as trying to just build an effective, efficient way to take care of your business above ground and keep yourself fed and things like that before you delve back underground. And the food system is kind of interesting because there are actually seasons in this game, in something like I guess similar to, say, a farm life sim, like Harvest Moon or something like that. It actually works in a similar way. The seasons will change the way that the world looks, and also the crops that you can grow successfully. You can find seeds by killing bosses, and also very occasionally the merchant over there will sell seeds for you to buy. And you can use these seeds to plant crops, and these can then be cooked into various dishes to help you live throughout your delves, which is pretty cool. And as you do things like cook things, harvest things, mine, stuff like that, you will gain experience in a separate experience bar to your normal character experience bar that's actually green, and that will level up your survival skills. And there is a 5-page like skill tree for different survival aspects that you can alter, like, you know, gaining better chances to get multiple ores when you mine ore, or the ability to place multiple like farming plots, to the ability to construct things like a chicken coop for a source of eggs, or things like an apiary for honey. All those almost life sim-esque things, and that's actually kind of neat because I don't think I've ever seen like an ARPG with these like sim-ish or survival-y elements, and it's kind of neat to see it. done fairly well. However, I do have one complaint. Winter. When it becomes winter, obviously things don't grow in normal circumstances, and you can't really find food as easily. Now, there are things like meat that monsters will drop, but they don't seem to drop it all that often, and just trying to survive off of the meat drops that you'll find is almost impossible. So you do need an extra source of food. And there are things, as I mentioned, like the coops, and there's like a barn for cows, I believe, and then there's the honey. But those are in their own separate tree when you go to level up your survival experience, and you probably wouldn't have known just how much you're actually going to need those things so that you can start investing in them early and at the expense of something else, unless you've already been through winter once and know how hard it is to suddenly find food. Now, there is a greenhouse that allows you to grow any seeds from any season whenever you want, but this greenhouse takes glass, and for glass you need sand. And I have not found a single block of sand in the entire game. I'm clearly missing something obvious, but I genuinely have no idea where you're actually supposed to search to find sand, so no greenhouse for me yet. So I will say that I think the survival aspects actually do add something to the game, and they make the surface level building and things like that a lot more satisfying, because you're sort of working towards the goals of keeping yourself alive throughout the actual delving experience. I will say that it kind of falls apart a bit, in my opinion, in winter when things get so scarce and so difficult to find that you'll sometimes just find yourself dying repeatedly from the food running out, and when you respawn from that, you actually only respawn with like a quarter of your total food gauge, so you'll already be hungry again, which gets a little bit frustrating at times. But I think that if there was something like a seed vendor, like an actual stall that you could build on your own that had someone that would guaranteed sell seeds to you, that would make a lot more sense, especially with the greenhouse, because it actually gets quite difficult to find seeds once there are no plants around, because you actually have to sacrifice the plants to get seeds for the most part. So being able to actually have a goal like that you can work towards to build yourself up to like a survivable winter and beyond after the first year, I think would be really satisfying. But currently it's kind of difficult to do so because seeds are hard to come by at times, and winter makes everything really scarce. But all that being said, I have still really enjoyed my time with this game so far. About 12 hours in, and I'm nearing the sort of completion of the first dungeon, you could say, and the game actually has an NPC that allows you to spend gold to respawn the entire underground dungeon, all the layers and everything, just restart it from the beginning, but in higher difficulties. So you can do like a nightmare difficulty dungeon that has its own materials and its own different challenges, which is pretty cool. And I think there's even another like 1 or 2 difficulties above that, so you can repeatedly respawn the dungeon with much harder stuff and new challenges and of course new things to do. And I find that the overall crafting system is pretty cool, because there's a fair amount of stuff to make while also not like undermining the fact that it's an ARPG and you're going to have to be finding a lot of loot by killing things, because of course that's one of the main draws of an ARPG like this, is to kill lots of enemies and find lots of cool things to make you stronger, to kill lots of stronger enemies. That's like the loop that you go into a game like this for, and the crafting system doesn't undermine that at all, and instead definitely supplements it, because you'll be crafting things like scrolls of identify, things like new potions, and your armor sets are actually crafted, although there are unique items that can drop rarely that are quite powerful in terms of like armor that you can find down below, but for the most part you'll be actually crafting full armor sets, and these do have sockets in them, and you can find gems to socket and upgrade yourself. Very ARPG-esque, that's pretty standard, and it works really well. And there are also just some other kind of weird things to craft, like a hat store or a pet store, or other sorts of buildings, like I mentioned, things like farm plots, mushroom growing plots, a greenhouse, and some other more magical stuff as well. So there's quite a lot to actually find and craft, and whenever you kill bosses or other rare enemies, you can sometimes get recipes for things like magic rings of a new sort, or a new blueprint for a new building you didn't have before, and things like that. So it makes the exploration and the above ground layer feel cohesive, and like, they're part of the same game. It never feels like you're sort of playing for 2 separate things where they kind of replace each other or anything like that. They definitely do work together quite well, and the boss fights, as you can see in the background, get very hectic and are really quite fun. The bosses have, I wouldn't say multiple phases, but they have patterns to learn, lots of different patterns depending on the boss, in terms of like summoning adds or using specific attacks that have specific patterns at different times, the kind of thing that you would probably expect from an ARPG, but done well in 2D. which is probably not easy, I would assume. A lot of like 2D bosses I always have a lot of respect for, and things like anything from Terraria to Castlevania, because it seems like it would be quite difficult to design an actually satisfying and interesting but still challenging 2D boss. And this game definitely does actually manage that pretty well. So as a whole, I'd say that I've definitely enjoyed the game, and there's really not a lot else like it right now, despite the fact that it may look like a lot of other 2D block-based games you have seen. It doesn't really play like any of them. It definitely plays like something completely different on its own, and I mean, I love ARPGs, and I always want to try like every single one I can come across because it's one of my favorite genres. So when I see something that does like survival mechanics in a 2D world where you can build your own farms and things, that's really interesting to me, and it actually does work pretty well. So this is It Lurks Below. If you'd like to check it out, the link is as always in the description below this video, and it is available for $20 or your regional equivalent, which it seems like a pretty fair asking price for what's actually here. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. If you like this video, then tell me. And if you don't like it, then feel free to click the dislike button and tell me why. So, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.